I found myself standing in front of a heavy oak door, my hands shaking so violently I had to shove them into my pockets just to hide the tremors from the proctors patrolling the hallway. This wasn't just an exam. It was the final threshold of the Architect of Nations entrance, a test so notoriously difficult that the passing rate had been 0 for the last 3 years. And the legend was that failing it didn't just mean losing a career. It meant your entire family's reputation was wiped from the social registry. As the lead proctor checked my pulse and scanned my retinas, I realized that the person sitting in the cubicle next to me had a vial of liquid tucked into their sleeve that looked less like medicine and more like a permanent exit strategy. Was I wrong for what I did next? Or would you have also chosen to betray the only person who ever believed in you just to survive the most brutal 4 hours of your life? Tell me if you would have done the same thing, because as the clock began to tick, I realized that in this room, we weren't students anymore. We were predators in a cage where only one of us was allowed to walk out with a future. To understand how I ended up in that sterile, terrifying room, you have to understand the world I grew up in. In our society, the Architect of Nations exam is everything. They tell us from the time we can crawl that our value as human beings is tied to a numerical score assigned once every decade. My childhood wasn't filled with toys or cartoons. It was filled with logarithmic tables and the smell of old parchment. My father, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the grease of the lower sector engines, used to sit me down every night under a single flickering bulb. He would trace the lines on my palms and tell me that those lines weren't meant for manual labor. They were meant for holding the golden pens of the architects. He sacrificed his health, working double shifts in the toxic cooling vents, just to afford the legacy tutors, who treated me more like a biological computer than a child. I remember the day my mother had to sell her wedding ring just so I could have the latest edition of the Structural Ethics Codex. Every meal we skipped, every winter we spent shivering without heat, was a deposit into the bank of my future. The pressure wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical weight on my chest that made every breath feel like I was inhaling crushed glass. My only friend during this grueling journey was Leo. We met in the prep academy gutters when we were 7. Leo was different. While I was a product of pure, agonizing effort, Leo was a freak of nature. He could look at a collapsing bridge and tell you exactly which bolt had failed just by the sound of the wind whistling through the girders. We became a binary system, orbiting each other's intellects. We shared a single room in the slums, the walls covered from floor to ceiling in equations written in charcoal. We had a pact. 2 seats at the table, or no seats at all. We spent years developing a private language, a series of taps and hums, so we could communicate during the preliminary rounds. We thought we were outsmarting the system. We thought our bond was the one thing the architects couldn't calculate. But as the exam date approached, the propaganda started to shift. The government announced that this year, due to resource scarcity, only one architect would be selected from our entire sector. The news hit us like a death sentence. Our pact of 2 seats was suddenly a mathematical impossibility. The week before the exam was a descent into madness. The city turned into a graveyard of ambition. You'd see students wandering the streets, reciting formulas to stray cats, their eyes glazed over in a state of exam psychosis. I watched Leo change. The boy who used to share his last piece of bread started hiding his notebooks. He started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. I caught him once, staring at me in the middle of the night, his eyes filled with a terrifying calculation. He wasn't looking at his best friend. He was looking at his only obstacle. I found scraps of paper in our shared trash bin. Practice tests where he had written my name in the sacrifice column of the ethical simulations. My heart shattered, but I didn't confront him. Instead, I started my own counterintelligence. I began to feed him slightly altered variables for the quantum load equations, pretending I was struggling. It was a dance of 2 vipers, each waiting for the other to strike while pretending to offer a handshake. We walked toward the testing center on the final morning, arm in arm, both of us carrying a concealed blade of betrayal in our minds. The testing center was a monolith of black glass that seemed to swallow the sunlight. As we were processed, the guards performed ego stripping, a process where they take your clothes, your belongings, and even your name, replacing them with a barcode stamped onto your wrist. I was candidate 774. Leo was candidate 775. The silence in the waiting hall was so thick you could hear the heartbeat of the person 10 feet away. When the doors finally opened, we were led into the pit. A circular room with hundreds of isolated glass pods. The air was pumped with a synthetic pheromone that heightened anxiety, a tactic meant to weed out those who couldn't maintain cognitive function under extreme stress. The first phase, the logical slaughter, began. It wasn't just hard, it was designed to be paradoxical. One question asked me to calculate the weight of a soul, using only the laws of thermodynamics and the current market price of iron. I looked over at Leo's pod. He was typing with a rhythmic intensity that terrified me. I realized then that he hadn't used the false variables I gave him. He had known I was lying. He was 3 steps ahead of me the whole time. By the second hour, the auditory hallucinations started. The speakers in the pods began playing the sounds of our families crying, interspersed with the voice of the lead proctor whispering our deepest failures. "Your father is dying in the vents for nothing," the voice hissed into my ear. "Leo is already finished. You are the failure." I had to bite my tongue until it bled just to focus on the screen. The ethical dilemma phase was even worse. The screen showed a live feed of my own neighborhood. It asked me to choose. Either trigger a controlled demolition of my own home to save a high-value industrial plant, or save my home and be responsible for the economic collapse of 10,000 families. I stared at the image of my father sitting on our porch, oblivious to the fact that his son was currently deciding his fate. My hand hovered over the execute button. I realized this wasn't about ethics at all. It was about whether I could be a cold-blooded administrator. I looked at Leo again. He had already made his choice. He didn't even hesitate. He clicked a button and I saw his face go cold, a mask of pure unadulterated ambition. So that is the situation I was in. I was trapped in a glass pod, surrounded by the ghosts of my own choices, realizing that my best friend was a predator, and the system was a meat grinder. I had a piece of information. A flaw in Leo's past that I had discovered by accident weeks ago. He had forged his residency papers to qualify for the exam. If I reported it now, he would be taken to the correctional blocks instantly, and the curve would shift in my favor. But if I did it, I would be destroying the only person who truly knew me. Before I tell you about the final confrontation, and the horrific truth I discovered about the exam's true purpose, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have pushed the button on your friend to save your family? Or would you have gone down with the ship out of loyalty to a ghost? The decision was made for me when I saw the collaboration prompt on my screen. This was the twist. The exam suddenly allowed us to link our pods. Leo sent a request to link. I accepted, thinking this was our moment to finally work together. Instead, as soon as the link was established, I felt a surge of data mining malware hitting my station. He wasn't trying to help. He was trying to overload my processor so my pod would shut down, disqualifying me for a technical failure. The betrayal was so blatant, so sharp, that the last of my hesitation evaporated. I didn't just report his residency papers. I used the link he opened to redirect the virus back into his own system, adding the forged documents as an encrypted payload. I watched through the glass as his screen turned bright red. The alarms in his pod began to blare. The proctors moved with a terrifying mechanical precision. They didn't just escort him out, they pinned him to the floor. Leo screamed my name, a sound of such pure agony and betrayal that it still echoes in my nightmares. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and I just stared back, my face as cold as the glass between us. The final phase, the void, was a descent into a sensory-neutral chamber. I was suspended in a tank of warm, saline fluid. There was no light, no sound, only my own thoughts. A voice, vibrated through my bones, asked, "What is the cost of a nation?" I replied, "One friend." The voice asked, "Is it worth it?" I replied, "It has to be." I spent what felt like years in that tank, arguing with my own shadow, justifying every lie, every betrayal, and every cold-blooded calculation I had made since I was 7 years old. When they finally pulled me out, I couldn't stand. My muscles had atrophied, and my mind felt like a frayed wire. They draped a white robe over my shoulders and led me to the Ascension Hall. I was the only one there. Out of 10,000 candidates, I was the only one who had reached the end. The lead proctor, a man whose face was a map of scars and cold logic, handed me the golden pen. "Congratulations," he whispered. "You are the first architect in 3 years. You have shown the necessary relational flexibility to lead." I moved into the inner city the next day. My father was given a pension that allowed him to stop working, but he couldn't enjoy it. The guilt of how I got there poisoned every conversation we had. He knew about Leo. Everyone knew. I was the boy who sold his brother for a view of the clouds. I spent my first year as an architect designing the very labor camps I grew up in. I realized that the efficiency I was praised for was just a code word for how many lives I could squeeze into a square meter of concrete. I started visiting the records room, looking for Leo. I found his file. It was marked with a black stamp, repurposed. I learned that the biological resource centers were actually where they sent the high IQ failures to have their neural pathways mapped for the city's AI systems. Leo wasn't just working. His brain was being used as a processor for the city's traffic grid. Every time I saw a green light, I wondered if it was a piece of my friend's consciousness making a calculation. The deeper I went into the system, the more I realized that the architects weren't in charge of anything. We were just the middle managers of a self-sustaining machine that fed on human suffering. The exam was designed to find people who were smart enough to run the machine, but broken enough not to turn it off. I started a secret journal, documenting every flaw, every shortcut, and every atrocity I witnessed. I realized that the only way to truly pass the exam was to destroy the institution that created it. I began to plant architectural viruses in the city's infrastructure, tiny, timed structural weaknesses that would take 50 years to mature. I was building a slow-motion apocalypse. I lived my life in the lap of luxury, attended the finest galas, and shook hands with the most powerful people in the world, all while secretly sharpening the axe that would eventually bring their towers down. I remember my father's final days. He looked at the golden city from the window of our high-rise and said, "It's beautiful, son. Was it worth the price?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't. How do you tell your father that the city he loves is a tomb? After he passed, I became even more reckless with my sabotage. I started leaking exam questions to the lower sectors, trying to flood the system with unqualified candidates who still had their hearts intact. I was caught by a younger architect, a girl who had passed the exam 10 years after me. She looked at me with the same cold, calculating eyes I had once used on Leo. She didn't report me for justice. She reported me so she could take my seat on the High Council. The cycle was perfect. The system had produced someone even more ruthless than I was to replace me. They didn't execute me. That would have made me a martyr. Instead, they retired me to the outer sectors, the very place I had spent my life trying to escape. I live in a shack now, within sight of the black glass monolith where it all began. I watch the new candidates march in every year, and I see the same hunger, the same fear, and the same capacity for betrayal. I am an old man now, and my only companion is the sound of the wind through the girders, a sound that still reminds me of Leo's voice. I realize that the toughest exam in the world isn't about what you know, it's about what you're willing to lose. I lost everything to gain a world that wasn't worth having. But in these final years, I've found a different kind of peace. I teach the children in the slums how to read the stars, not the textbooks. I tell them that the only real architecture is the one you build with the person standing next to you. The cracks I planted in the city's foundation are finally starting to show. Last night, the great spire groaned, a sound like a giant's heartbeat stopping. The elite are panicking, but the people in the gutters are just watching and waiting. The exam is finally coming to an end, and this time, there will be no passing grades. I look at my hands, they're stained with charcoal again, just like Leo's were. I'm writing this story on the back of old blueprints, hoping that someone somewhere will understand that the toughness of an exam is often just a mask for the cruelty of the examiners. If you've ever felt like the world was forcing you to choose between your success and your soul, I want you to know that the soul is the only thing that lasts when the towers fall. Like this video if you think the system needs to be burnt to the ground, and subscribe to hear more accounts from the survivors of the Great Selection. Comment below with the word rebel if you would rather fail the exam than lose your humanity. I have lived as an architect, and I will die as a laborer, but for the first time in my life, I am free. My father's dream was a nightmare, and Leo's nightmare was my reality. Now the walls are finally coming down. I'll see you all in the next story, where the world is just as cold, but the truths are even sharper. This cycle of testing is a machine that requires fresh blood to keep its gears turning. And I refuse to be the oil anymore. I remember the cold nights in the prep academy when we thought the golden pen was a magic wand that would solve all our problems. We were so naive. We thought the architects were gods, but they were just scared men in tall buildings. The real power isn't in passing their tests. It's in realizing that their tests are irrelevant. I spent 50 years trying to fix a broken system from the inside, only to realize that you can't fix a building whose foundation is made of bones. You have to let it fall. I see the young students now, and I see the way their parents look at them, with that same desperate hope my father had. It breaks my heart every single time. I want to tell them that the inner city is a desert of the soul, that the food there tastes like ash, and that the music sounds like a funeral dirge. But they have to learn it for themselves, just like I did. My only hope is that the viruses I planted will act as a mercy killing for a civilization that lost its way. When the lights finally go out in the spire, maybe then we can start building something that matters. Maybe then we can look at a bridge and see a way to reach each other, instead of a way to measure a load. I am ready for the end. I am ready for the silence. And I am finally ready to see Leo again, even if it's only in the dark. Like this video if you were on my side, and subscribe for more stories like this. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I'll see you all in the next story.